Tarik and Linna run a firm of architects in Paris and in Casablanca called Oualalou+Choi. Their office has won numerous awards, including the Architecture of Expo 2015, the Rice Alliance Spotlight Prize. They've been finalists for the AFEX Award, which is a very prestigious award for French firms doing work outside France. They've also won the Young Arab Architects competition and numerous other awards they've been premiated with. They're probably best known for the last year's Expo Pavilion for Morocco. Before that, in Venice, the Venice Biennale, the 14th Venice Biennale, 2014. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what I've managed to dig up on Linna and Tarik. Linna was born in Seoul, correct? She went to undergrad at Yale and then went to grad school at Harvard. After that, worked with Venturi Scott Brown and then at Fred Schwartz in New York. She's taught at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, at Harvard, Boston Architecture Center, Rice also. Tarik had an equally interesting arrival in Paris. He was born in Rabat. He came to architecture school at the Quai Malaquais, and at the same time he decided to do an undergrad licence in engineering, civil engineering, I believe, and in fine arts as well. So he didn't have much spare time, I believe, in those 4 years. He has also taught at Rice, Quai Malaquais, MIT, RISD as well. So, my understanding is that the meeting of the two minds happened in Fred Schwartz's office in New York when Tarik was there on a stage. And then you were in Paris, 2001. You established the office here in 2001. And it was just after, or just around the time that 9/11 happened, and you decided to stay here rather than return to New York. And we are all the better for it. Before I invite Tarik, who's going to do a presentation, I want to explain that this is the fourth episode of State of Grace, Rencontre 2016. We have others planned for this year, and we'd really like you all to come to those as well. So the format tonight is Tarik is going to come and give us a presentation, and then after that Linna and I will join him on stage for a conversation, and after that we'll open up the floor to your questions. Tarik.
Hello, everybody. Actually, I like the fact that we're not that many, so I'll be able to go as far as I can with this conversation. When Robert invited us to do this, and I really thank him for having us here, as well as the Columbia Global Center, I imagined that he wanted us to talk about how we work together, since the overall theme is collaboration. We work together with Linna, or how we work with the people in our office, or how we work with our client. But the reality is that what we could be saying about how we work together isn't very interesting. It's very mundane. And the things that are interesting really shouldn't be said. Both Linna and I are quite secretive, probably in different ways. But the reason why we don't talk about what happens in the office. It's because in order to do what we do, which I'll explain later on, we have to do complicated things. We have to lie, we have to cheat, we have to beg, we have to cry. It's messy, it's sweaty, it's not very elegant. And a lot of architectural presentation try to polish all that process. And I actually think that polishing it takes away some of the magic that is at the core of what we do. But more than this, all of this presentation creates generations of projects that are made the way they are imagined to be presented. And that's something we try to avoid. The way we understood collaboration was slightly different. It's not about a partnership, but it's about a surrender. It's about a toxic and disastrous obedience. Can you say obedience in English? Obedience. So we'll talk less about what we do and less about how we do it, but mostly about why we're doing it. And in short, however that would sound, we'll try to tell you what's wrong with architecture and how we're fixing it for you. So let's start. First fact, architecture builds in and for a system that is toxic. It ruins the only planet we have. It creates fabric that make it impossible for any form of political realm to exist. And it erases the presence of the body. Second fact, it's not architecture anymore. It's made with something that looks like architecture, it smells like architecture, but it's not architecture anymore in the sense that it's been replaced by a different form of practice. I show this image because geologists have an interesting analogy for it. They call it pseudomorphose. It's when a mineral replaces completely another mineral in its shape, in its color, in its place, but with a completely different chemical composition. And this is exactly where we are now. Most of us still think we're practicing architecture, but it's been a while that we're not doing it anymore. Architecture is hardly pertinent and almost never necessary. It's a downer, right? All right, before we explore how we can make it work again, how we can make it necessary again, I would like to take us a step back and see how we got here. I'm taking a quick analogy. In the early 60s at Yale, a young sociologist called Stanley Milgram started an experiment trying to understand how it was possible that normal, decent people during the Second World War could be part of a horrific machine of extermination. The notion is that it wasn't everybody that were crazy, that there's a system of authority that took away the capacity for people to make choices for themselves. So he devised this experiment, and I'll explain it very quickly, because you'll understand that it's very relevant to our talk. So it's a 3-people experiment. There's a subject on the one side. On the other side of a window, there's an accomplice who's attached to a chair and connected to the electricity. And then there's the sociologist asking the questions. The subject has to push buttons that put electricity into the accomplice in front. He doesn't know that in front of him, the person that actually doesn't get electricity. And for every question that he can't answer, he raises 15 volts from 15 to 450 volts. Obviously, the last bits are lethal, right? Here's are the results. In 62, 65% of the people went all the way. The person who's observing this is not obliging the subject to do it. He's only asking him to do it. He's asking him once, he's asking him twice, 3 times. The 4th time, if he doesn't comply, the experiment stops. In 62, 65%. They did a revised version of this, a televised version of this, about 7 years ago. And the result went to 89%. Thank God for television. But the interesting part is to observe all the different steps that people go through. First step, they show that they aren't happy, that they're happy to be asked to do this thing because they're decent people. Second step, they have a nervous laughter. That's the body expulsing stress. Third step, they try to cheat. They try to give the answer to the guy across the window, right? First step, there's detachment and denial. And 4th step, they try to find excuses to explain their behavior, right? Let's look at them again. First step, we are unhappy. That's our critical culture in architecture. Nervous laughter. It's all the comic exploration. Trying to cheap and help the patient. You could say that's Aravenia. Detachment and denial, corporate America. Trying to find excuses to explain his behavior, French contemporary practice. Why is it necessary to disobey? You could say obedience is good. Here's the problem. Architecture has three prerogatives. We have to build for our client, the man. We have to build for every man, people who are not the one paying us to do our work, but who are part of the people who experience it. And we have to build for everything else, for the birds, the climate, the tribes, for everybody. And the second and the third part, they're gone. We only comply to what our clients are asking us to do. So, first possibility is collaboration. Second possibility of practice is a form of retreat. And that's what we observe in academia or in form of autonomies of practice that find hedonistic pleasure in making places and retreat themselves from the world. The third option is what we try to do. We call it trench warfare. And I'd like to explain how we get here. When we started to work with Linna, about 15 years ago, we wanted to build beautiful building in beautiful places for beautiful people. After a little while, we realized that architecture was mostly about a cultural resistance, a means to dialogue with the culture and the territories. But now we consider that the only form out for us is a form of revolt. And our project is a new form of modern project in a way, a form of modern survival, which we'll talk about. So, how do we do it differently? In order to propose a different form of practice, we have to recognize that the role of the architect has shrunk to a very small parcel of responsibility. So the first thing that we do with Linna is extend the role of the architect as much as possible. We start the project earlier. We finish the project much later, which I'll explain how we do that. But we also consider that issues like brief, client, site, budget aren't given elements. They're fluid parameters of a project that need to be questioned and never taken as such. That's the culture of the office. Next to that, we've built an arsenal for our little guerrilla. And it's a very lonely trajectory. And this arsenal has to do with trying to evacuate some of the key notions that are part of the architectural discourse and that we consider are imprisoning the field into what it's doing in this global Earth genocide that we're organizing. These notions are context, program, materiality, sustainable development, public space. So what can we talk about if all this is gone? I've just took 5 things away that are at the core of any form of architectural conversation. The next half an hour, I'll try to replace some of these notions with notions of our own and explain why these notions are actually toxic to the practice of architecture. Okay, first one, the question of context. There's not an architect that doesn't talk about context. But the context in the end is the suitcase of the global architect. In a strange way, it emerges the moment of criticism of the modern movement. That's why I show this image of Rudowski's Architecture Without Architect. In the early 60s, there was this notion that we had to rediscover places and the elements of architecture that emerge over millennia. And that actually brought in a shift from history to geography. To each place, a solution to a problem. And it brought in a culture of solutionism in architecture where it feels like we have to solve equations wherever we go. But the problem in the end is that context becomes a form of projected identity that is figurative, simplistic, often insulting, one that can be picked up in an airport lounge or an hotel lobby. So how did we do it before that? You didn't need context before. Nobody talked about the context before the 60s. You were part of a place. You had empathy. You could be inserting yourself in a situation. You would never hear Barragan talk about context, or you would never hear Alvaro Siza talk about context, or even Oualalou+Choi talk about context, because they're part of the places where they build. Obviously, that puts a problem for the international practice of architecture because it talks about the notion that you have to be part of a place to build in it. So we try to remove completely this notion and replace it with other possibilities. We use words like familiarity and acclimatization in English. Familiarity is not nostalgic. It's not about repeating existing recipe. It's about using memory as a form of typology. It's about inventing plausible places that haven't been built yet or that don't exist yet. It leaves spaces for people inside the project. It's a form of non-trademark, open-sourced, unfinished architecture. Acclimatation, and I show this image of a beautiful jardin d'essai in Mauritius called Jardin Pamplemousse. This notion that was built in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which came with obviously the colonial period, where you would take plants from a place and try to adapt them to another place. This slow transformation and mutation of a body to a place. In the end, that's what architecture is mostly about. It's gentle. It has the notion that it's not universal, but it has the capacity to transform. And that happened to architecture in Brazil. That's Niemeyer. It happened in modern architecture in Morocco. And that's Zevaco in Agadir. And all those are gentle acclimatation of a modern project. So let's go back to no context. By the way, I'm showing a lot of images of projects and architects that we like, and we say very bad things about it. That doesn't mean we don't like them. We just consider that they're dangerous. Form of familiarity. We built this little project in front of l'Institut du Monde Arabe, which was about, it was a temporary project for an exhibition that happened there, and we considered that this building had to be familiar to everybody that was around there. So we chose the form of the tent, which is both universal, it resonates in every culture, but we use a material that's only built in one place, in the desert of Morocco. But we built this building as a frame between two buildings, l'Institut du Monde Arabe on one hand, and Jussieu on the other. In this particular case, it wasn't building a tent that already existed. It's using the familiar notion of it to create something completely new. We've used this time and time again. This is a completely different project, and as you'll see, I'm not going to talk about the project much. I'll just illustrate some of the ideas through the project. In this project, it was about finding a relationship between the inside and the outside, between the column and the wall, between the part and the whole, and in a way that people would feel that it would be in a completely new environment, but that would resonate with everything they carry with them. It doesn't have to be somewhere in particular. That's where I talk about the importance of memory in the way we allow people to transform and use the places. And that we could simply say that we don't like our buildings to be one thing. We don't really like to tell people what it is. We're always happy that people transform them and use them in different ways. Okay. Second problem, program. The question of program has been part of the body of architecture for the past 35 years. But beyond the fact that it means that architects are no longer part of defining what is the usage, program replaces the notion of the value of use. Now, program is a simplification of reality, and buildings are made in computation and arrangement of colored boxes. And we don't think that's what architecture should be about. It has one fundamental flaw, is that it creates buildings that are determined, buildings that are made to do one thing. If buildings are made to do one thing, then they get obsolete very quickly. If they get obsolete very quickly, then they don't have the capacity to be eaten away by the history of architecture, the capacity to transform, to be used for other things. And which is why we replace this notion by resilience and cannibalism. I like this image because it shows that a Roman amphitheater can become an urban figure in Lucca. That's another interesting image. It's a housing project from the 50s, adapted housing in northern Africa. With, the cover of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in 1953. It was the poster project for the Siam. And when we did a very big exhibition in Casablanca with Jean-Luc Cohen about 15 years ago, I was asked to go photograph this building as it was today. And I had the address. I kid you not. It took me over an hour to find it, and I couldn't, because it became like this. The notion that a building has the capacity to be transformed, that it's planned for something, but that planning doesn't work. In here, the idea of the architect is to say, the Arabs love patios, but we're going to verticalize them. It sounds like a big project, right? We're going to put people in vertical patios, but what people want is just an extra bedroom. If the capacity of architecture to absorb transformation isn't there, that's what you have. So what we look in what we do is we take the building as it is. Whatever program, whatever situation, whatever budget is thrown at us, and we try to find ways in which it can transform. This is a quick, it's a very long project we did in the Medina of Fez of rehabilitation of 5 caravansérails. And this is one of the most interesting situations where we had 2 buildings that were attached to each other, one from the 14th century, one from 17th century, not at the same height, never been connected, and we decided to wrap a stair between them and create one building out of it, and to see how the courtyard typology that makes the Medina would react to this. And it worked quite well in the end. That's what I call a form of cannibalization and capacity for building to be resilient to their environment and whatever we throw at them. Okay. Third problem, la matière. If you've seen the last 15 years of architectural exploration, it's all about how architects now are part of material research. They work with the industry, they invent and patent new materials, and they project this on their building. It would be a good news. The problem is that it means that architects are reduced to a crust that's 2 meters around the building that we call facade, and at the exclusion of everything else that happens inside. So material exploration, yes, but not at the exclusion of having the capacity to imagine what would happen inside the building. Most of what we do, what architects do, is a beauty contest. We work with skins, which is the reason why we fight very hard to make that skin move from being 20 centimeters to being 2 meters, and we consider that's a huge success. But in the end, there's very little left. And we try to move away from this notion of material experimentation, strictly, to see how the relationship between material and the body can reactivate our relationship to spaces. And that could also mean create spaces that are not comfortable, spaces that are difficult to inhabit, because comfort isn't a value. The difficulty to inhabit a place is also our capacity to interact with it. If you always go for convenience, then you have Southern California suburbia, where everything is done with car, everything is central heating, everything is easy. But if you look at the notion that you could live in slightly uncomfortable places, then you could be in Venice or Paris. Nobody wants to live in Venice. It's not comfortable. They don't have cars. You have to walk miles to go to the supermarket, and yet it's a desirable place to be. So comfort and desirability are 2 very different things. One exploration about this relationship between the body, the comfort, and materiality is what Robert was talking about quickly when we did the pavilion in Milan, for the Moroccan pavilion at the exhibition last year. It was quite interesting because Morocco has done every single international exhibition since 1867, and every time doing the exact same building, an imitation of an existing traditional gate with arcades and tiles and mosaic and so on. So we tried to propose something else. The theme for Expo last year was Nourrir la planète, nurturing the planet. So we thought that the contribution of Morocco wasn't about agriculture, but it was about ruralité, about rurality, which is the opposite of agriculture. Rurality talks about the balance with the environment, the balance with the resources, the balance in the sociological fabric that makes it exist. To give you an idea, Morocco is still a monarchy today. If the cursor of the people who live in the countryside to the people living in the cities had moved from, say right now, 50-50, where 75% urban, 25% rural, then it wouldn't be a monarchy anymore. the basic political system is based on the fact that the culture is mostly rural. So we tried to see how we could, and again, I'm not saying this is either good or bad, I'm just describing it. This is televised, and I have kids, so I'd like to see, I'm joking. It's not about being good or bad, it's just the way it is. So we decided that one way to express this relationship to ruralité is to use one single material, earth, adobe. We've patented a way of prefabricating it. In very large cases, there are 2 meters by 2 meters by 60 centimeter deep, which we've assembled. It's a single block assembled all throughout. But mostly, we wanted to create a space that has no barrier, no weather threshold. It's open to the air and only creates shade, thickness, resilience, so that when people go through it, what they experience isn't the idea, the Orientalistic idea of what Morocco is through the imagery, but is how their body would move through one of the spaces that you would see in the traditional Medina or in the village in the mountains. So it's about how the material transformed the relationship to body in very uncomfortable ways, in the sense that it was too dark in moments, too bright in moments, too hot in moments, too cold in moments, but it created a journey through that building. And in the end, it allowed for a very unique experience. All right. After materiality, after program, after context, I want to talk a little bit about sustainability. First, as you may tell, I hate sustainability. Sustainability is toxic. Why is it? Those diagrams, by the way, became a rule. You don't turn in a competition if you don't do a diagram like this, where you have a little bit of solar panel, a little bit of passive wind going through, a little bit of photovoltaic things, a way to cool down the water from it's all garbage. For a very simple reason. Sustainable development means we want the current situation to stay like this as long as possible. But it's already changed. Climate change is here. So trying to sustain the current situation is a rearguard battle. So here's a simple truth. Sustainable development is invented in the places that are responsible for climate change, but that are also the last one that will be impacted by it. Isn't it a little bit insane? So what do we replace it with if we can't have it? And our position is that we can't hold on to something. We're the last generation of this humanity, a humanity of opulence, a humanity of, comment dire, sans inquiétude, without being worried. Our kids will have to live differently. It's our responsibility to invent a new form of architecture for this. And sustainability isn't it. So we consider that our responsibility isn't about sustaining the current situation, but it's about inventing ways in which we can build landscape and build climates. So what is building a landscape? It's not about doing gardens. I show this image because landscape has to do with memory. The guy who did the talk right before me, Sébastien Marot, who's, by the way, is a very tough act to follow, has described beautifully the relationship between memory and landscape. And if you go in places in the south of Morocco, you will often see these walls, which are very bland. You don't know what they're for. They're never used. People play soccer around. They're used one time of the year. After one religious holiday, there's one prayer, and you have 250,000 people who are using it. But the rest of the time, the memory of that usage is what creates the landscape. The capacity of a line to just organize the territory is enough to create a landscape. And I'm going to talk about a couple projects where, and Linna will talk about that maybe later, we've been fascinated by this notion of a line. The line being a notion where you reduce the architectural dimension to the point that one of the third dimension of space disappears. That's either so thin and so long that its thickness almost is immaterial. So it's not the line as it divides in front and a back, but it's aligned as a space that you can inhabit. We worked in this absolutely beautiful and gorgeous landscape. It's the ruined city of Volubilis in northern Morocco. It's one of the most beautiful Roman remains there is in the world for a simple reason that nothing is built around. You see Volubilis today the way the Romans have built it 2,000 years ago. Cypresses, grapes, wheat. The landscape of the La Plaine du Zerhone is beautiful. And we were asked to build a museum there. It was quite a complicated adventure. What we decided to do is to invent a project where the disappearance of the building was embedded in the building itself. So it wasn't an idea of a ruin, it was a ruin in the making. So we used the only three materials that were available there: wood, stone, and concrete. Very Roman material, everything was used within a 2-kilometer radius. And what we built is a dam in an area that you see there, which is very unstable. So the building in the end isn't a building. It's a very long line that is 250 meter long, 7 meter wide, and that is a rosary, can you say that? A chapelet? Of buildings, which creates a landscape. It is sometimes sunken, it is sometimes suspended, and all the time it's holding its own. The most important part for us was that when people arrived at the site, that they wouldn't see the building. So the highest point of the building is lowest than the lowest point of the site. So I'll show some very quick images of this. Linna and I love this building. It's one of the buildings where we've learned our trade. And one of the amazing things about it is that it took almost 8 years to build. It's not very big, but it was built with a slowness that most architecture should have. It was built with local, very not sophisticated contractors. The concrete that we built there is not your sophisticated Peter Zumthor Swedish concrete. It's thick, it has acne, it has presence. We have so little money that in order to have a facade, we used very expensive wood, cedar wood, to do the formwork for the concrete. We poured in the concrete, we dried the concrete, then we took out the wood, we cleaned it, we aired it for a year and a half, and then we put it back on the facade of the building. So we can't talk about sustainability, that just hurts me. Okay, other forms of building climates. And that's a very recent project we're working on right now in the office, and construction will commence shortly. Don't look at the master plan, which couldn't be worse, but I'm talking about this little building here. It's a high school in the middle of the desert, literally in the middle of the desert. And the temperatures are quite extreme, and we had to find a way to inhabit a territory that's quite big, and find a ways in which it becomes a desired place to be. So what we did, very simply, is not cover the building, but use the building to cover the public spaces. So all the classrooms are in a thick plaque that's 10 meters above the ground. It's about 15,000 square meters, so it's huge. It's about twice the size of this Columbia Center. And what it does, it covers a space and creates an ecosystem below that is desirable. Well, not only people can use it, but all of the public spaces of the school are. So the typical horizontal division of spaces that you would have here becomes vertical simply because we are here to create a climate that makes it inhabitable. Otherwise, living in this space wouldn't even be plausible. And a last element about the climate, and that's just a wink because we're working on the village for the COP22. The COP is the conference of the parties on climate change. It happened last year in Paris with a very big agreement. It's happening next year in Morocco, and we were tasked with the crazy project of building a village from scratch, 200,000 square meters that we had to build and organize in about 6 months. And what we've proposed is not to actually build it. Most of the buildings are temporary, but we've created a very long landscape. It's a canopy that's about 1 kilometer long. These are chunks of it. So it's a birdhouse. You see that? It's a birdhouse. An aviary. Merci. But that is not that's open to the sky, where it rains. It changes the temperature, and it's holding a transformative landscape underneath. And these are construction images taken 2 or 3 days ago. And we're interested in seeing how a very long spine like this, which is the only thing that will remain after the Conference of the Parties, will be the embryo of a new territory and a new landscape in that site. So, okay, we've dealt with sustainability. What's left? Public space. Everybody talks about public space. But here are the things. Nobody builds it anymore. We live in public space that was already built, and we love it. Everybody loves La Place des Vosges. Everybody loves La Concorde, but we're incapable today. The conditions to build these kinds of spaces don't exist. We build spaces that are commercial. We build spaces that are common, that belongs to communities, but the capacity to build a new, municipalized, democratic, used public spaces just don't exist. So what we've taken as a task with Linna is to put all the public spaces in our project. One of the obsession of our office is not to put our building in relationship to public space, but to bring in the public space or the public prerogative within our building. And these are form of transgression. I show this image of Jemaa el-Fna, which is one of the most beautiful plaza in the world, in Marrakech, for a simple reason is that it's not defined in dimension. Its size changes with everything that happens throughout the day. It's a constantly negotiated space. So I'm going to show a couple forms of transgression. This is a project for a municipal theater in Casablanca. We had a very beautiful site, which I'll show in the next picture, which you'll see up here. It was one of the last pieces of garden that existed in the city. It was not built, and in front of it, there's the main plaza of the colonial composition. And when we saw the site, we said, yeah, you have to keep the garden. That's too small for the big program. Let's build on the plaza, around the plaza. Let's make the theater part of the public space. Let's find ways in which there's porosities. So it's not just for the people who can afford going there, that you can look at the backstage, that you can go through. It's also built on the culture of halqa, which is the traditional form of theater in Morocco, where you have somebody in the middle and people around telling stories. Obviously, you couldn't win since you build on a site that's not yours. But once that, and that's the problem for these kind of things, once you've said it, once you've imagined that it's possible, you can't take it back. You know you can't win, but you have to do it nonetheless. Another project like this, this was a roundabout between 4 of the main streets in Rabat. And we're commissioned to do a parking for a very big company who wanted parking for the people who work there. And actually, the picture is taken from their tower. And what they wanted to do is just this. We fought with them, we discussed with them, and we decided that it would be better, instead of just doing a parking, to building a plaza and making 2 of the roads that you see on the edges pedestrian, to anchor it to the rest of the city so that you don't have to play Frogger to go to it. But then we realized that in order for this plaza to work, because it's so noisy and there's so many cars and pollution, then we have to sync it. Because the only way for a plaza to work is to bring in the commercial components to it and create a connection to the rest of the city. The problem is when you sync it, you reduce the amount of parking you're going to build. So we had to reinvent completely their program to find the possibility that the commercial components, which they didn't have in mind, would be the element that would offset it. One of the biggest problems they've had with this project was the fact that they needed something in the middle. The notion that a space is not programmed worried everybody. And for 3 years after it was finished, it was closed. Nobody could go to it because people are worried that street vendors, that people, boyfriend, girlfriend, people who would talk politics, that you create a space of possible insurrections. But that's what it is. These are spaces of possible insurrections. And there is this whole notion that they tried everything. Even after a visit of the king to New York, he came back and he said, why don't we put an ice skating ring? He had just come back from the Rockefeller Center in the winter. Let's put an ice skating ring at the bottom of it. Let's do something. Just don't leave it like this. So for 3 years, they let it be. You can imagine how anxious we were because there's no plazas in this city. It's a city where public space are boulevards. It's commercial and walkable. It's not static. So in this particular case, the only moment they opened it is when they had a very large music festival in the city. They had no place to put a stage. And I received this picture the next day, which obviously I called my insurance company to make sure that the floor slab could hold that many people because it was not designed for it. But once that happened, one event opened it to the city. After that, it slowly was swollen by the city. One last project, which is very dear to us, as you can see, to the left, your typical commercial master planning. They took a beautiful piece of land that was the old zoo. This is a place where I used to go when I was a kid. At the time, it was far from the city. It was a journey to go there. 50 hectares of beautiful landscape. And this is what they do to it. They build the first crust at the bottom and on the edge, and it's so bad that the city says, you can't go on with this. So they launch a competition to reinvent what would be a form of inhabiting this landscape. So we propose what's there, which is keeping exactly the same density, multiplying the green space by 7, reducing the roads by 3, and building on the traces of the existing zoo landscape. But that also comes with creating a new form of îlot. To the left, an interpretation of the Osmanian îlot on steroid. To the right, a form of îlot that we didn't know what it would be, something that is oversized, to the point that the core of it becomes public. Here, you have street in front, courtyard in the middle. There, the street goes through the block. The courtyard are actually large gardens, are all connected to each other. We actually had no idea whether it would work or not. It's finished. These are some images. And as part of the project, we were tasked to build some of those blocks, and we're finishing some of these buildings, which are strangely disgraceful. I don't know how we can say this. They're not pretty. They don't have a proportion that we're used in terms of urbanity, but we had to invent a new way of touching the ground, a new way of creating a sky, a new way of closing an interiority. So that was for public space. The only thing that we have left is the city. And we say no more planning. The entire planet is being master planned, one little parcel at a time. And when I say master planned, I mean the same way. This is a beautiful image that could be anywhere. It happens to be near Madrid, but you would have exactly the same in Dubai. You would have exactly the same in California. The same tools for urban planning are used everywhere. And those tools are tools that are tools of war. The road, which is the base of infrastructure, is the only thing that we use to make the city. But the road is not it's not an element that is neutral. When Caesar came to Gaul and built his roads, it was for his armies. When the Israeli army in Gaza builds the roads, they change the relationship of time and space. To go from Gaza City to Khan Yunis, it took 8 hours, 30 kilometers. Roads are used as a martial form, which is why in the office, when we talk about urbanism, we call it a martial art. So we try to find new ways to build and invent cities. Because we have to invent cities, because the world is being urbanized. We can't say people stay in the countryside. We can't also just all live in sedimented cities like Paris or Venice or New York. We have to build cities quickly. And I know in France we don't like to say this because the history of les villes nouvelles were not very well received. But a country and a civilization that still can imagine the pioneering dimension of anchoring itself somewhere, it still has some vitality. But you have to keep something in mind, is that building a city is always about two things. It's about colonizing a territory and about allowing its uprising. You can't imagine Haussmann without imagining that the immediate result of Haussmann was la Commune de Paris. You can't imagine the colonial urbanism of Henri Prost without understanding the uprising of the cheminots in Casablanca in 1907. You can't imagine the Eisenhower Highway Act without imagining that it was in 1954 dimension for the US Army to be able to go east and west. There is a Marshall dimension to planning, and the pendulum effect of that is that it's taken by the population and it always has an uprising effect. So when we design territories, we always position ourselves on the edge of what is a colonization system and the edge of what is a necessary uprising, which is two elements that make a livable city. I'm going to talk about two last projects to finish, which are two strange urban projects. This first one, and that's not us, by the way, this first one is a territory that's in the middle of nowhere, but quite beautiful. It's about half of the size of Paris. You can see the outline on Lower Manhattan, the outline on Paris. This project is on 3,500 hectares of absolutely beautiful land. And it just so happens that it's far away from the city of Rabat, in a place and a country that has no money. So the state isn't going to bring you all the amenities you need to build a city, which are the roads, telephone, water, sewage. None of that exists. So we had to invent a form of a city that could be self-sustained. What does it mean? We're building a city for a finite number of people. It sounds a little bit crazy. When Le Corbusier built his cité d'habitation, he called it l'unité d'habitation de grandeur conforme. He thought that there was a finite number of people. It shouldn't be more, it shouldn't be less, to sustain this form, 1,645. So what if we can imagine cities that are not about eternal growth, that there's so much that the land can give without us hurting it more? So in this particular case, our dimensioning tool is water. How much water falls, how much water we can harvest, how much water we can treat, how much water people use and then can be retreated, and based on that particular number and the most efficient closed system, we decided, or we devised, that this city couldn't sustain more than 150,000 people, which is not bad, by the way. And we do this by looking at the site and trying to understand its topography, the rivers that go through it, connect the rivers between them to create a blue network that are protected, and then devise it not as a city, but as a agrarian structure, where the urban block is big. It's as big as a farm. It's 5 hectares. And the project is a way of colonizing a farm system. If you think about Saint-Germain-des-Prés in the 14th century was farmland. Today, it's organized, the streets are organized in the structure of the farms. There's a direct link between the agrarian structure and the capacity to colonize it. So instead of projecting artificial block dimensions, let's organize the colonization of this system. Then the road system, and then we define the simple things of where is buildable, where is not buildable, and where can be colonized over time. We decide on few places of density, and we connect all of this into something that is not the drawing of a city, but are means of colonization of a territory. Okay. At last, and this is in no sense a symmetry with the first image, not at all. These are two humanists that signed a deal in 2007 when Gaddafi planted his tent on the Invalides. In 2007, Gaddafi came to France and he did many deals. He bought radars and he bought arms he later used against his own population. But he also made a deal with the state of France to help him replan all of Libya's great cities. So l'IAURIF, l'Institut d'aménagement et d'urbanisme de la région Île-de-France, which is a fantastic entity which imagines the growth of the entire region around Paris, was tasked with designing or redesigning 50 cities. So they took the coast, okay, with Tripoli and Benghazi, and the desert, not interested, they asked us to deal with it. And the desert in Libya is the southern border of Europe. It's the Darfur. There's a Billard effect. People from Darfur come to Libya, people from Libya come to Italy, people from Italy come to France, and people come to France want to go to England. So Europe is investing heavily in all possible urban infrastructures and sustainable life there so that it doesn't come our way. So it's not all very generous. It's actually very cynical in the calculation. But it put us in a very complicated situation at the office because we were to work not on a city like the previous one, like Bebzir. We were to work on something that was about twice the size of France. And if you look at this image, which I find quite beautiful, you see what they call the river of sand. And it literally acts like a sea, because you see the buildings, the cities, are organized along a train track, almost like you would see in the French Riviera, or you see in the Italian Riviera. It's a rosary of cities. So we say 50 cities, the reality is that it's 50 villages, within that there's 5 cities, and within that there's one large capital. Here's the problem. There's tons of water, but it doesn't rain. The entire region is sitting on huge amount of fossil water. But it's not gonna last, and they're using it extensively. So we had to make a crazy decision and tell people, all of the cities are gonna be gone. They're not gonna stay. You're gonna have to find ways in which you're gonna move a large amount of population in clustering them in metropolises within the desert so that it can be sustained as long as possible. It's of an extraordinary violence to be able to say that to people who've lived there generation and generations. But there's no choice. We're not equipped to work with this. Urbanism as a discipline is based on the eternal growth of the city. It was invented during the Industrial Revolution to allow for the growth of traditional capital. We don't know of any urbanism of shrinkage. We don't know of the capacity to make cities disappear, giving them back to nature. And by the same token that we believe we have to be able to invent new ways to make new cities, we also have to invent new ways to kill cities, to give them back to nature. Because what happens in Libya will happen now with very large portions of the planet where we will have large migration for war, obviously, but also climate migration. But there's also economical migration. This issue that we've faced in Libya, we're facing it in the States. We have very large portion of suburbia that is uninhabited after the subprime crisis, and we don't know what to do with it. So by the same time that we have to invent an urbanism that dialogues with the territory, we have to find a way to give back part of the city back to nature. Merci.
Tarik, that was, I was expecting to have a whole lot of notes and points on which to tackle you on. But I found myself agreeing with a lot of what you said. Linna, what is your take on, do you agree with everything he says?
With everything? No, most. I mean, it's a position we've formed over the past 15 years together. There are very few things that we disagree on a professional level.
Right. Okay. I'm not going to get into the.
No. Yes. No.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear? Can everyone hear? Okay. Keep the mics very close. Okay. One of the things that really was the most interesting for me was the idea of sustainability, which seems to drive so much of discussion in architecture today, and your view that it's about maintaining the status quo and from the West. What I really was interested in Morocco, how is that idea of sustainability seen by the local authorities and communities?
It's seen the same way it is seen here. Everybody's using the same empty rhetoric. Although I do think that territories like Morocco are some of the theaters where we can invent a new way of doing it, because you are at the intersection of a northern opulence and the culture of rarity of the south. So those places that are neither too poor nor too rich are the places where you can propose different ways of living for people, and yet still be anchored to a contemporary form of economy. But everybody's using the same metric. It's depressing.
Yeah, but at least in places like Morocco, you still have most of the population who use passive forms of sustainability, right?
For economic
They use passive
reasons.
form for everything.
Coupled with the fact that, I mean, for instance, Morocco has just built one of the biggest solar fields on the planet.
And there's talk of that being transported to Europe.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're talking about solar, for example, which is one of the big tenets of sustainability, as it's cynically called in Europe, or in a sort of a Western sense. The problem with the idea of sustainability and with the idea of alternate energy sources, which has been developed and being developed to a very, very high level in the West and being manufactured in China, has come up against the re-exploitation of fossil fuels. And it's coming up against that all the time. So there are huge forces at play to continue the status quo.
Yes.
We have America becoming quasi-self-sufficient in oil using shale gas. Enormous pressures on Paris, France, to use shale oil, which again calls on resources of water, enormous amounts of water in areas where they don't have it. So in terms of that electricity, or that idea of being of the great solar, is it lip service, or is it genuinely something that Morocco will?
How can I say this? I don't know and I don't care. But let me just explain this. Alternative source of energy, or all source of energy, is still about using as much energy. So the question for me is, how can we invent new forms of building cities, creating buildings where we reduce drastically, and that has to do with reducing our level of comfort. So it's a rear guard issue for me. We're still, I don't know if you've seen the movie La Haine by Mathieu Kassovitz.
Yes.
You have this character who, through the entire movie, keeps saying, "Jusqu'ici tout va bien." So far, so good. And the last scene, he jumps off the roof and he keeps looking down and he's like, "Jusqu'ici tout va bien." This is where we are. So the answer is, "Jusqu'ici tout va bien." But
Right.
it's our responsibility, Robert, and I'll start joking, it's our responsibility to consider that if we don't rethink completely our practice, we will not be able to be part of the necessary mutations that will be part of the next generation of humans.
I understand that, but as architects, the limitation of what we can force our clients to do or to accept, like you say, to tell these cities that they won't exist if they keep going like they're going.
You know the Mai 68 slogan? Soyez réaliste, demandez l'impossible.
Yes?
It's the only way. Right now, if we consider that we have clients, then the conversation is over. We have people who pay us to do our job. They're not our clients. We have a responsibility that goes far beyond what they're asking us to do. So if we're imprisoned in a kind of Renaissance relationship between the prince and the architect,
No, I understand that totally. I'm not that's not what I was trying to say. I was just trying to point to the impossibility of having the opportunity or being able to convince people that this is what they need to do. That's the difficulty, is it not?
That's the part I told you we couldn't talk about. Let me tell you this. I hope that this presentation that I did today convinces you that's what we do. We precisely go beyond these impossibilities. And we do it with moments of, we take risks, we have complicated relationships with our client, we have complicated relationship with the authorities. But because of a certain stubbornness, and because of the fact that it works, and because of the fact that we don't deny them that they should make money, that it's not bad, we're not ayatollahs, we're not crazies, we just consider that there's an agenda in the project. The agenda in the project doesn't have to be always so overt. Linna and I like to hide it. But if you don't have that alternative agenda, and that it's just about keep going with the same conversation, then there's no point in continuing.
No, I agree with you very much there.
This is from your message of hope. Huh? I'm not trying to
no,
be depressing today.
no. I understand. I think when one talks about projects and so forth, it is not specifically about the client. It's about the project. It's about the greater environment that you're dealing with. There was an interesting mention there of context and the whole idea of contextuality and so forth. But in fact, I see that context can be applied to your work, but it's a mutation of context that you're talking about rather than context generating what you're talking about. You start from a point, from the situation of the site. So the idea of context is there.
Tu veux répondre? Here's my problem with context. It's the textualization of a situation. We always start with a situation, but we don't look at it from outside. We embed ourselves in it. It's like embedded journal. We go with it, right? So we oblige ourselves to be part of it, to feel empathy, to give a little bit of ourselves.
So you're complicit.
We're more than complicit. We're activists. We have a dimension that goes beyond our work, which is we build NGOs, we work with them. We consider that in order for us to have a meaningful impact, we have to be part of a situation. So sometimes it takes time in places you don't know. That's the reason why I can't work in China. I don't get it. It's not that it's bad. It's just it would be irrelevant for me because I'm a man of la Méditerranée, okay? So
right.
My realm is la Méditerranée. Doesn't mean I can't imagine one day working there, but it wouldn't make sense now because I have no sense of understanding of the culture, a deep understanding of the culture, of my place in it, and how meaningful it could be. If I have to do an extra little building there, I'm not interested. And I think that's the problem with context. When I say people use it as a form of a shortcut. It's something they pick up in airports and hotels. I mean, I have the greatest respect for Nouvelle. I have the greatest respect for Rem Koolhaas, who's a humongous architect. But they're the context. There is no conversation with the culture at all. There's Jean. Look at what he did in Abu Dhabi.
Yep.
That building for the Louvre is amazing. Nonetheless, it's dangerous.
The whole of Abu Dhabi is dangerous.
I could not agree more. So for me, the notion of context is not looking at it as a text. It's looking at it from within.
I understand.
Not leaving you much to work with.
No, it's fine. That whole discussion of context is sort of, and I guess I wanted to ask Linna a couple of questions about that because you worked with Venturi, and later with Fred. And you want to?
Do you think of Fred as a contextual architect?
No, not really. Um, but I think more Venturi as if not being a contextual architect, being the person that spurred that a lot of that movement making things fit in, or to look at for the language of the work, at least.
Sure. But like with many things that Bob did, he starts things because the way he does things is in a very enlightened way. It's very informed, very educated, very sophisticated. What people do with what he does is another question. It's
Well,
matter altogether.
Well, I think perhaps that's a bit of the clue. Is it beyond that? The acolytes, a lot of the acolytes, or people that studied under him, or people that came out of that, what became postmodern historicism, in a way, what they did in the cities, in gentrifying cities, using contextual models, dealing with the status quo, repeating.
Sure, it's the same thing
and
Tarik was
maintain
talking about. It's shortcuts, right?
Yeah, it's exactly the.
Yeah, it's exactly that.
It's exactly the same. And I guess in that thing about commenting on Venturi, it's the same comment that one could make about, to some extent, about Corbusier, about it was the people that came after him
Sure.
that did all the damage,
Exactly.
rather than himself.
You can say the same thing about Rem
True, but we're not.
to a certain extent now.
With a much greater impact.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
we were talking about this the other day. There was a school behind Le Corbusier. There's definitely a school behind the postmodern. But Rem is an airborne virus. He's percolated all schools to the point that there is no contradiction. There's only complexity.
True, very true, very true, and it is everywhere. You're getting thesis coming out of the schools in Australia, I've seen, and it's just like,
Yeah, I mean,
it's repetition.
we fight with our students to kind of take away the brainwashing, because again, Rem and his minions, made some amazing buildings, but the way they are instrumental or instrumentalisé, the way they are used and being used by a system that itself is trying to perpetuate itself. That's where I have a problem. So talking about a building separately, you can't say anything because the guy is amazing, he has talent. But what it means in the entire trajectory is toxic.
So in terms of architects who are practicing today, you talk about Rem, you admire him, you admire Nouvelle. Are there others that you admire their work, or in the realms of what you're talking about? Is there any colleagues?
Let's put it this way. It is so hard to make a decent building that whenever somebody manages to do it, I'm a fervent admirer. So I make a difference between certain extraordinary buildings and the trajectory that builds them. If you take somebody like Piano, less extraordinary building, amazing trajectory. Raphael Moneo, amazing master, educator, intellectual, puissant. But there's not always that spark that exists in other architects which have probably more intuition and have made buildings are probably will be marking history more. So I'm less admirative of trajectories than I am of certain buildings. Let's put it this way.
Right. What I was trying to get at is there somebody's work that you feel is out there doing similar things to what you are proposing?
Je sais pas, qu'est-ce que tu en penses?
I mean, there's the whole crew at the Biennale, right?
Yeah.
From the last Biennale, Aravena's.
This Biennale,
yeah,
the one that's...
the Aravena.
Yeah. I mean, what we're saying echoes a lot of what other people say. It is both a new discourse, but it's something that is starting to be shared, even if it comes from different angles. And it also has to do maybe with a shift of generation, a little bit, without getting into that. But the problem is that there's no depth yet of construction. We are fortunate that we've been working for 15 years, and we've been working on very large commission early on. We're barely 40 years old, and we've built many, many projects. So in a way, we're people who are same generation are probably don't have yet the same depth of work, even though they have the same concerns, I guess.
So in having all that opportunity, how do you see that your work has changed in that period, or your attitude to things has changed in that period, or developed or evolved? Or is that not for you to say?
I think it's one of those sausage-making questions.
Yeah, it is a sausage-making question. Let's put it this way. I said it previously in the presentation, we wanted to do beautiful building, and then we entered into conversation with territories, and now we're in full-on revolt. That is there. We get more radical with our positions, which is not to say that buildings are better. It's just to say that we're clear in the reason why we're doing this. Now, how we're doing it, that's just too messy to talk about.
No, I don't want to know the messy bits. I think that's great for now, if unless you've got some other comments, but I would like to open up questions to the floor if anyone has any questions.
I'm not sure how to explain this. I'm a photographer, not an architect. I was really amazed by your talk. I mean, completely took me by surprise, and sat here trying to synthesize it, thinking, what on earth is the architecture that you're talking about? And I went through a kind of a series of, like 3 phases. First of all, I thought, well, it's like dynamic architecture. It's not static. You build a building, there it is, everybody walks away. So dynamic. And, then I thought, well, it's more also in situ. It's like urbanism in the French sense, it's more, looking at it in terms of the town. And then I really got it for me. It's a personal thing, not unrelated to the photo as well. I got straight to Genesis. What you're talking about is stewardship in the religious sense of the word. Purely the religious sense of the word. We've been given the planet, and we are in charge of the planet, and we must manage everything. And I was thinking, what on earth do you do as business people with what is essentially a spiritual concept, whatever your faith or non-faith might be, but it's your challenge isn't business-like at all. It's the spirit. How do you deal with that?
Okay, so that's the problem when you do talks like this, is that there's always somebody who sees behind the mask. Linna really tries to tone down a little bit the prophetic tone, and she's right. I should calm it down a little. But you're right on point. We feel very deeply a sense of urgency. Now, we make it work because I don't care about being right. I care about moving forward, because being right, I could be teaching and then lecturing and telling people what to do. I'm interested in finding a path where people pay us money to do it, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. So that's our challenge, is to find ways in which we compromise enough to be uncompromising. And this compromise is something that we like. Radicality isn't about being right. I don't care about being right. I care about moving forward. So and I don't have any problem with money. If somebody wants to make money, I'll make him money. And part of this job is a service industry, and we have to serve them. We're not necessarily the best at that, since we're always late and always too much work and so on. But we do it. We have contracts and we oblige by them. But there's also these 2 other dimensions outside of the contracts. The fact that we don't build for our client. We build for you guys, and we build for the rest of things that are alive and not alive. That we build for bees, this sounds a little bit stupid, but when you start a house in the middle of nowhere, you start building, you put a fence, you put water, all of a sudden there's a tree that comes up, insects start, there's a life that starts, it's amazing. That's an amazing power that we have. And to not use it with a certain gravitas, and to just joke around, then I would think that would be a bad use of our time. Architecture is hard. You have no life, no friends, no family, no money. So if you don't do it well, just do something else. Is that a fair description?
Well, Rudy Ricciotti says it's a sport de combat.
Et c'est après ça que j'ai dit que l'urbanisme est un art martial. Just to... But this notion of stewardship is something that we are interested in. And that comes from a non-religious, non-believer, but a very worried person.
Are there any other questions?
Hi, good evening. I've just got a real simple question. You talked about one of the projects where you built a building in the middle of the desert, and it was used. The building was actually used to make a canopy for living spaces on the bottom. How is the building? Is it cooled with like central air, or is I was just curious about that because when to use an example like Dubai, where you go to a city and even the bus stops are air conditioned, and I was just curious how you could kind of physically cool down a space that's 10 meters high without it.
Actually, it's a very good question. What we did is almost build a form of troglodyte architecture. We almost built a crust of earth, and then we carved it. So the entire thickness of the building, it's 10 meter high, but the building itself is 8 meter thick. So everything that comes through it is absorbed by the building and diffused. So the space below is about 15 degrees lower than what's above. So I'm not saying that it's cooled down to the point that it feels like air conditioning. If it's 45 outside degrees, then it's 30 below. But 30 you can live with. And what happens is that at night, because the thickness of the plaque swallows the heat, at night, when the temperature drops, because you're in the desert, then it starts emitting that heat below. So it raises the temperature under. We've honestly haven't invented anything. What we've done is simply use it at a much larger scale and find the ways in which people don't live next to each other, but on top of each other. There's a life above and there's a life below, which is probably the hardest thing to imagine. But once you've gone past the fact that you have to go from here to here, but you go from here to here, then all of a sudden you can use very old systems. You saw that plaque had patios, atriums, which are 15 meter by 15 meter, which allow for the air to go through, the hot air to, basic stuff. Zero, it's, I'm going to quote somebody else, it's engineering without engines. There is no cooling system whatsoever.
I think you find that a lot of these systems are available, and that's understanding local context and history and technology. And often the technologies that you find in these areas are the best technologies because they've had so much time to develop, and you're just looking at a different scale. But for example, there are wind methods, spraying sails with water. There was an adaptation of that for mines in Australia, and the original idea came from Egypt. It was just done on a different scale.
The basic question we ask ourselves in a situation like this is, how do you inhabit something that should not be inhabited, that is not made for human habitation? And there'll be a time in history where we said, you know what, it's not a good place to settle. Romans would have never gone there because there is no water, no hills, but now we have no other choice than to find ourselves in situations where we have to inhabit those harsh situations what we create is nowhere near the comfort we'll have in Europe. It's not going to be fun for those kids. I mean, it's going to be fun, but it's not going to be, like going in the school in the Marais. But it's real.
Are there any other questions?
I had a question actually about beauty and aesthetics, and how do you define beauty within your paradigm of working?
That's another question we'd like to avoid.
That's for you. That one's for you.
How do you define beauty? I don't know. I think that question might be beyond something I can answer right now.
Okay.
I mean, besides, none of our buildings look the same. We don't have a style that you can recognize, although Robert seems to think he's finding one.
Yeah, I think there's something there.
Since we start each project, it's very much a virgin project. But perhaps the one thing that runs along through it is, it's very minimal in the end, what we do, don't you think?
I think that's one question where Linna and I have very different answers, and I think that's very healthy in a way.
I don't
So,
disagree about much. No.
couple of elements to answer this. First, the form. The form comes very, very late.
Yes.
We don't like when the formal dimension comes too early in the project.
We're very suspicious of it.
So
in fact.
we allow it to rise slowly, okay? And because it's never drawn. Something gets, elle se lève, je sais pas comment on dit. We allow it to rise. And for me, beauty is that slowness. It's if you can control the speed at which the form of the territory is made, and if you allow people who are going to go through it to modify it, we often say that we don't finish our buildings. Our buildings always feel unfinished, not to everybody's liking. But it's something that's important to us, that there's room for other people. If you look at a lot of architectural photography, the buildings look like the Mornay, how you say that? Stillborn, right? It's too controlled, it's too perfect, it's held. There's no sweat. That's not for us. We like to leave room for things to happen after we're gone. And I don't know if it's good or bad, but I think beauty for me comes from letting go of the control.
I think also that's probably the worst question for an architect. What is beauty? And especially talking about their own work, what for them defines beauty for their own work. It's not for them to say, in a way. And they can only make, if they're genuine to themselves, they can only make buildings as they can make them. That's them. And if someone finds that beautiful, great. If someone doesn't, bad luck. But that's the way it is. You are what you are, and you do what you do, and they are making responses, and yes, a lot of those responses are aesthetic, and they feel right to them. But and you could define that as beauty, I don't know if it's for you to say, if you can say that, or if you would say that.
We have no canon in the sense of something we try to achieve. I think we imagine that time, imperfection, weathering, transformation, and truthfulness. I think it comes from the inside. I don't like cheating, because otherwise it looks too much like cosmetic surgery, right?
But you're happy to cheat to get there.
Absolutely.
Oh, sure.
And then some.
A different question. I was extremely struck by your relationship with your clients. Best way I can encapsulate it is, so Donald Trump comes in and says, build me this. So as an architect in front of Donald Trump, you will build him that. That's not what you do. I'm fascinated by your process of achieving dialogue with your clients, even to the extent, as you gave an example, no, don't build it there, build it there. Now, you can't really do that with Trump because he owns this building, but you can do it with a city. But this whole dialogue with a client saying, no, I'm not doing that, how far does it go? Have you lost any contracts with this?
Many times over, because it is many times over. Okay, the key thing is that it's not a dialogue. It's a power struggle. You have to be more powerful than him. If you put yourself in a situation where he asks you to do something, you've already lost. So you have to create a form of desire. Il faut créer le désir. You have to create the desire within them to do something that they would not do, absolutely not. If I had other talent, I would have liked to hypnotize some of my clients. It didn't work. But in the end, the reason why people work with us, and knock on wood, we've been very successful, we've done a lot of things, and we're doing very well, is because in the end, we give them a form of human adventure. A human adventure. When they come in on a roller coaster ride, and they like it. So here's the problem with that. They only come to us for complicated things. Because they come to us for things that they don't know what they should do, right? So you start having this tag of, okay, the guy who's gonna make the needle stand on its fat, we have this tag of people who can do something with something very complicated. Sometimes we're like, please just something simple, tranquille. So now we've built an entire culture in the office to try to, at every beginning of a project, or even to invent the situation in which we're going to make it. When I said that site, budget, client, regulation, all of those are fluid systems. It doesn't work everywhere, and doesn't work for everybody. So something tells me that Trump and I don't know, it may not happen. But
does it
honestly,
depend if he's president?
Hmm?
Does it depend if he's president or not?
No.
No, okay.
But to be honest, I think that these kinds of people are the easiest to work with because their software is binary. You understand them. You can play them like a $10 banjo. You don't have to be so overt. Most of what we do, we hide. We don't. If you go and buy a baguette at the bakery, you just want to buy the best baguette. You don't want the baker to come out and to do a lecture for an hour and a half on how he wakes up, where he gets his flour. There's a hidden agenda, and it should not be shared. There's a black box, a space within which it stays, and that's the office and people around it. And we have no problem, hiding that very, very deeply. Now, sometimes it resurfaces quickly, and you have to work with it. So it's not a dialogue, it's a power struggle. And you have to create this sense of desire. Je sais pas? No?
Yeah, oftentimes the most interesting part of a project, at least for us, when we talk about, for instance, the public prerogative, it happens almost without the client realizing it. He won't necessarily be against it, but it's not important. It's a side effect.
We do certain things for them, we do certain things against them. And there's no harm in that. Now, Americans in corporate culture can't understand that you go against the guy who pays you. But he pays us to deliver a public service. So he doesn't own us. He chooses to work with us. He should know the risks. But it works. It's not easy. There's no formula, which is the reason why we can't repeat anything. Every project you have to build an architecture for the project, an organization that works. And it is sometimes tiresome because there's no recipe. But that's the reason why it's exciting. Good?
Yeah. Oh, there's a question. Two more questions. Okay.
Thank you for the talk. You talked about the toxicity, like the 5 different toxicities. Is there something that's missing that or should be changed in the education system that educates architects?
Oh, boy.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, you can't open that box now.
Okay.
That's the next talk.
How long do you have?
Oh, wow.
We can say one thing, and then Robert, I think, will want to answer that as well. There's never been a point in recent history, say the past 150 years of architectural schools, where the schools have been so removed from the necessity of being an architect. They used to be that you were trained with a trade. You were trained with tools to then face the world. Now you're trained like puppies to enter the world. You're educated, you're domesticated. Schools have two major problems. They are removed from the world to prepare you for the world. It's a very strange system where the ivory tower is now sunken. I don't know how to explain it differently. So I would not want now to be a student in architectural school, but therefore we teach. And we teach, again, same thing. We teach for an American school here in Paris. We've been teaching in the States for a long time. When you look at the culture of American education, you understand why there has been no great architect emerging in America. The last guy who did Stephen Hall, 75 years old. It's a system that doesn't produce greatness anymore. It produces very good people who will be performant in corporate system. Bon, so that's the depressing part. Now what you should do is travel the world. 1 year in every school. 1 an en Italie, 1 an en France, and because we should be learning the way we always learned, which is by traveling. That's how architects used to educate themselves. Travel the world with a sketchbook.
Are you a student of architecture? All right. Congratulations.
But it's the best job there is.
Wait. Question at the back?
I'm very curious to know why you are so opposed to sustainable materials, maybe, and sustainable architecture. Because you made that very clear. It's almost like it's ugly.
Well, it is ugly, but beyond that.
Well, that's relative.
Let's put it this way. I'm not opposed to sustainability as a way to try different things. I'm opposed with the notion, which is embedded in sustainability, that we're thinking about making it last as long as possible. Sustainability is about duration. How long can we continue to live the way we live? What I'm saying is that we have to reverse the problem, because we can't be living the way we live. We can't stop climate change. Sustainability is about delaying the moment it's arriving. We're already there. We have to change completely. So for me, when I say it's toxic, is that it's putting a blindfold on people. It's even worse than that. It's giving architect absolution. Here's the problem. Architects feel guilty. They feel guilty because they're one of the responsible chains that deteriorated the territories and the planet. They're responsible. So then all of a sudden you tell them, if you put everything green, you're a good boy. The problem isn't that. Now, the danger is that the people who have invented this notion are also the people who've created the climate change. But they're also the people who wanted to delay its effect, because they're also geographically the one that will be affected the last. So if I live in the Maldives right now, then I'm really pissed at sustainability, because it may allow somebody in New York City to continue to live the way he lives, but with 25 centimeter rise in ocean water, my house is gone. So it's not sustainability we have to invent. It's a completely new, radical, survival, modern project we have to build together. I'm not against sustainability on principle. I'm against what it means. All the projects we do are sustainable. We'll use, but it's common sense. We use less water, we'll use less energy, we try to use local materials. But I feel it's almost pornographic to talk about it. If you don't do it, you shouldn't even be doing this job. It's common sense. Now, when the common sense becomes something that stops you from realizing there's a major shift in the way we have to build this planet, that's where I'm against it. But not on principle. But I agree with you. The aesthetic of sustainability is also quite ugly. Do I make it? Was I clear?
I think we'll wrap this up before Tarik falls over. I want to thank you both
Thank you.
so very, very much for coming. You've enriched our series. This whole talk will be available on video very soon. And we want to thank our good friend here, Hakim, who happens to be related to Tarik, and to Raphael, and to Lauren, and to Columbia Global Centers for helping us with the event tonight and all of our events this year. The next one is scheduled for the 1st of December. However, I'm working on something that may happen in November, but that's something that Lauren and I need to talk about. And we'd really love you all to come to our next ones, and please, if you want to look at some of the past things that have happened, you haven't been here, have a look at our site, stateofgrace.fr, and we'll see you then. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.